Hey guys, Will here. So welcome back to our video series on upgrading your sim rig. So in part one, we had a look at the Logitech G923. We got it mounted up on the Next Level Racing GT Lite cockpit. And yeah, we kind of did some comparison between what the driving experience is like, the immersion, the lap times, the consistency between a G923, a setup like this, and a far more expensive sim rig like the one that we drive day to day. We did some lap time comparisons around Nordschleife as well. So check out that video first if you haven't already seen that one. But in today's video, we're going to be doing our first upgrade to the system. So we're going to be taking off the G923, so the wheelbase and the pedals, and we're going to be upgrading them with the Thrustmaster TS-XW that you can see behind me here. So that was very kindly provided to us by Pagnan Imports, and at the time of making the video, it was around about $1,000 Australian compared to the $599 Australian for the Logitech G923. So we're going to be taking a brief look at the hardware and seeing what we actually get for the money today, but the main focus of today's video is going to be on the overall driving experience, both in terms of immersion, impact that it has on consistency and lap times as well. And hopefully by the end of today's video, you'll have a good understanding of whether not only is this a worthwhile upgrade should you already have something like a G920 or a G923, or whether you're actually better off to start off with something like this to begin with in your sim racing journey. So hopefully by the end of the video, you'll have a clear understanding of what's going to suit your needs and budget best. From here, we'll move up to the Thrustmaster T-LCM load cell pedals as well and see how they go. And we're also got a Thrustmaster TS-PC, which we'll be testing out later on in the video series as well. So stick around, this one should be an interesting one. Okay, so let's have a look at what we get in the box with the TS-XW from Thrustmaster. So we get a 6 Nm belt-driven wheelbase. We get a Sparco P310 replica steering wheel, which is a 310mm, as the name would suggest, diameter. That is a step up from the 270mm that we get with the Logitech range, but we'll talk about the driving differences there and feeling and things like that a little bit later on when we go for a drive, of course. So it is a replica steering wheel. You wouldn't want to use one of these in a real-life race car, but it is branded with genuine Sparco gaming branding there. And there's a couple of differences here as well between this and the TS-PC wheelbase, which is, as far as I understand, at least mechanically identical, other than the fact that that's not Xbox compatible. The main difference being that we have this red cover on here as well, which is part of the branding that comes together with the Sparco collaboration that they do here. But we'll talk about the wheelbase some more and the wheel and everything a little bit later on. This is detachable too, so we can rotate the little collar here, and the wheel just pops off very, very easily. So we just slide it off and it comes off just like that. There's a little tiny DIN style connector in there. How many pins is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pin DIN connector. And that simply just slots in to the female side on the base. We spin the collar around and it locks in position. Now, one thing I will just show you quickly here. Now, we're not going to go into a massive amount of detail here on this gear because, you know, this product's been around for 4 years now and there's plenty of detailed reviews on this product already on YouTube. In particular, I'd suggest take a look at SimPit, Sean Cole's review. He did a really good job of running through everything in detail with measurements and all that kind of thing too. But we've got a little self-tapping screw here that's going into the soft plastic. So the idea there is if you're only going to be using it with the one wheel, you can actually run that self-tapper through. It'll go into the soft plastic on this side and that'll keep it nice and fixed into position. But you do want to be careful there if you're taking it on and off all the time. Obviously, depending on how much you tighten this collar up, will alter the position of the screw as well. So you want to be making sure that you're always screwing into the same place. So obviously not up to the standard of the Fanatec quick release, for example, or some other more high-end quick releases. But the fact that we do have interchangeable wheels here without any sort of aftermarket modification is obviously something that is a plus for the Thrustmaster when you compare it to something like a Logitech G920 or G923. So let's pop that quickly back on now and we'll move over to actually we'll look at the power supply next because that's quite an interesting design too. So this is a 24 volt AC 4 amp or 96 watt maximum output power supply. You guys don't really care about all the specs, I know, but it's an interesting design here, obviously designed to look like a turbo. We actually have it's not actually a turbo, it's a centrifugal supercharger, but you can see very similar design there with the impeller, and obviously the pressure comes through and that's how we get boost. So kind of cool there to see how they've kind of carried the automotive theme through. But the most important thing here that I wanted to call out for you guys quickly is that it is a 220 to 240 volt power supply. So depending on where you are in the world will depend on the power supply that you get. It's not a switch mode power supply like what we get with most electronics these days. So if you're moving to a different country and taking the gear with you, you will need to have some sort of an inverter or power adapter beyond just the travel style plugs that you can get. If you try to plug this in overseas where they're running off 110 volts, you're going to have a bad time. But another thing that I'm noticing here in comparison to the cheaper Logitech stuff is that we do have higher quality cabling here as well. So I mean, you can see that's nice thick multi-core cable there. If we compare that to the Logitech power supply, quite flimsy, and you know, that is obviously much more likely to get broken. Now again, remembering that the Logitech stuff is a lot cheaper, but these are the kinds of things that you're getting when you're spending a little bit more money. So these are the kinds of things that I wanted to draw attention to, and that sort of carries on throughout the entire design, even just down to things like the cabling that we get for the pedals, and you know, even the USB connection is a high quality cable. Just little things that we notice as we step up in terms of quality. Now we also get a table clamp here as well, so we can mount the base directly to our table should we wish to do so. And one of the things that we'll definitely be talking about in this video as well is whether a entry-level cockpit is going to be enough to stand up to the 6 Newton meters that we get from this base as well. So we'll talk about that when we go driving too. But you can mount this directly to a table should you wish to do so as well. We also get a little sticker sheet, pretty basic stuff there. Seems like a decent sticker sheet. Doesn't seem like it's going to be the sort of stickers that are just going to kind of, you know, wear off or anything like that. Obviously not up to the same standard of quality that we get with something like an Asher Racing or a Cube Controls wheel, but we wouldn't expect that at the price point. So it's nice that we get that option of customization there should you wish to do so. But let's have a look now at the T3PA pedals that come in the kit. So obviously we do have a couple of different configurations that are possible within the Thrustmaster ecosystem. And one of the strengths here with Thrustmaster is they do have quite a lot of different product choices that you can pick and choose from depending on your needs and budget, of course. So that's something that we're definitely going to focus on throughout this video as well as the future videos is, you know, whether you're better off buying a bundle like this or whether you're better off buying, say, the TSPC, which is just the base and a different wheel, and then going straight to load cell pedals or something like that. So we're starting off here with the T3PA pedals. They also come with this little mod kit as well, which is like a little brake stopper on the back, which we'll talk about in just a moment too. But look, they're pretty basic pedals. They feel a little bit more sturdy than the Logitech pedals do. Again, they're potentiometer based pedals, so there's no fancy electronics or anything like that. They are using the position of the pedals, including the brake, to translate that information through as braking pressure in the game. So not as accurate and not as high quality as, say, load cell pedals or pressure based pedals, but you know, they should get the job done for the majority of people. And obviously we'll talk about that when we go driving in just a moment. We have a throttle, a brake, and our clutch. There's no sort of two-stage effect to the clutch or anything like that. But there's a couple of little quality things that I notice here. One thing I noticed straight away is that there's a little rubber pad inside on the plastic arm, which actuates on each of these pedals, and that sort of dampens the sound as well. So when it does return back, it's not too loud. There's a little bit of a plasticky sound there, but you know, it's obvious that they've put a little bit of attention to detail there, at least into making sure that these are suitable for, you know, the sort of environment where people are likely to be driving with this kind of gear. So, you know, in a living room, there might be a bedroom next door with a kid or, you know, somebody else asleep that you don't want to wake up. So those kinds of little details are important. It's good to see that those things haven't been missed. Now we do have a little bit of adjustability here as well. We can move each of these pedal faces both up and down and left and right to adjust for different size feet. And again, if you want to see more detail on measurements and how all this works, go and check out SimPit's video, which I've linked down in the description for you guys. Now I'm just going to pass the base over to Tom quickly here as well, because I want to bring the Logitech pedals, or pedals I should say, into the shot, because there's a couple of things I wanted to just point out here. So a lot of people wonder why they include this little brake pressure kit sort of thing as a mod, so to speak, as they call it, rather than just pre-installing it on the kit. Now I think the reason for that is because if we have a look at the design of the pedals underneath, you've got these little rubber pads which work well on, you know, a slate floor or a wooden floor or something like that, or tiled floor. But there's no carpet spike or no sort of way to make these stay still if you're playing on carpet outside of a cockpit sort of scenario. Whereas with the Logitech pedals, we have this little retractable strip down the bottom here, which if we pull the little tab, that should slot up into position like so. And that actually allows these pedals to grip on the carpet. And that actually works really well. It's something that I've used back in my earlier sim racing days before I had cockpits and all those sorts of things. And you know, I used that quite effectively for about 10 years on my Logitech G27 without any need to have it on a rig at all. Now, what I found is these pedals are perfectly fine if you do have them on a surface like what we have on the table here. There's enough pressure there that if you're just using the brake normally, they don't move around too much. But as soon as you install the brake mod, you do end up putting a little bit more pressure there and they do start to move around on carpet. So I'd say if you're installing this, you're probably going to want to have this in some sort of a fixed cockpit, whether that be, you know, some sort of a wooden frame that you connect to your chair or anything like that. It doesn't have to be elaborate, but definitely I think would be the reason why they're including this as a mod and not pre-installed. But it definitely does have an impact on the driving experience, and we'll talk about that in just a moment too. So essentially the way this works is it installs in the back of the pedals here, and essentially it slots in and it screws into position. And then what happens is when we brake, the brake actually pushes up against that, and that gives us a little bit of extra resistance, which we can then modulate around. Now, one of the things we talked about in part 1 of this video series was the importance of having some sort of a threshold point or some sort of a change in pressure where you can modulate your braking around. So when you're threshold braking, you want to push your pedal down to a certain point, which is going to be your maximum braking threshold, and then you can modulate around that, whether you need to increase the pressure slightly, maybe you're not quite reaching maximum brake performance, or you're needing to sort of back out a little bit. And having some sort of a tangible tactile point throughout the throw of the brake pedal is what allows us to set that muscle memory and really sort of increase that performance and consistency in our braking. But we'll elaborate on that more when we go for a drive in just a moment, and we will test with and without that mod as well to tell you just exactly what kind of a difference it makes, and of course compare to the performance with the Logitech pedals too. Now, one of the things we did mention with the Logitech pedals is that with the G923 and the updates that they've done there is quite a nice threshold point there as well. It's not as defined as what you have with this though, so it's going to be really interesting to see how that impacts our performance. Now, there are of course aftermarket mods available as well, and that's something that we'll probably look at in future videos as well, but sort of a little bit beyond the scope of today's video. But yeah, we're pretty happy with the performance overall with these pedals, and we were able to reach pretty decent consistency and overall pace with these pedals as well. Now, there are a few other differences that stand out here, such as the fact that they're using plastic arms here for all 3 pedals on the Thrustmasters, whereas the Logitech ones are metal. You know, I don't think that it's really important to talk about that too much here in the context of just a side-by-side comparison. I think really where that becomes important is whether we actually notice any difference or any flex when we're driving. So let's set the pedals aside now, and let's grab the 2 wheelbases and wheels back into the shot and do a bit of a side-by-side comparison here as well. So let's talk firstly about the functionality we actually have on the wheels themselves. You guys can see for yourselves, obviously, the differences in the layout here, but I guess the call out things here are the fact that we do have a rotary encoder on the G923. We do have a multi-position switch here, as in a 5-way switch, so we can go down, up, left and right and push button. It's not a funky switch or a 7-way switch. It doesn't have the rotary encoder feature like what we have on the Fanatec wheels, for example. So that is one thing to call out here. Look, but basically that is replacing the functionality of our D-pad here as well as one button. So you could say that little switch there itself replaces the functionality that we have here. For example, we've got a plus minus switch, which we don't have here, but otherwise it's basically pretty self-explanatory. The other difference, of course, is that we do have the LED strip here, which can be used for RPM, whereas we don't have any sort of indicator lights or anything on the Thrustmaster. But other than that, the shifters are actually very similar to each other. The G923 paddles actually have a little bit more mechanical resistance to them than the Thrustmaster does, but look, overall, very, very similar. The design's very similar as well. It's just little micro switches internally. And, you know, nothing really of, you know, remarkable difference there at all to speak of. Look, the buttons themselves on the Thrustmaster, they don't have a whole lot of tactile feedback to them. You can kind of squish them down a little bit before they click, but you know, the feeling's kind of lost when you're wearing gloves on those. So they're definitely much cheaper switches than you can find elsewhere on more expensive gear, like say, if we're comparing to the more entry-level Fanatec wheels, for example. And I know a lot of people will be comparing what you get here with what you get from say, a entry-level wheel and a CSL Elite from Fanatec. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video too. But otherwise, the buttons are pretty similar between the two of them. I really don't see an advantage of one over the other. Obviously, the Thrustmaster has a more genuine kind of race car look and feel to it compared to the more toy-like looking G923. And other than that, it's all just kind of subjective differences there, I think. One thing I will mention is that the shape of this being a slight D shape at the bottom, but otherwise round, is a little bit more versatile in terms of, you know, being able to do things like drifting, rally style driving, formula style driving, and kind of everything. Whereas the Sparco 310 replica with a flat top and bottom does make it a little bit more difficult to use for things like drifting, rally, and anywhere where you're going to sort of need to slide the wheel through your hands and grab it at various different points of rotation. This is definitely a wheel that you're going to spend more time gripping at 9 and 3 as opposed to sort of being able to move your hands around freely on the wheel. So just something to be aware of there. Again, of course, this is interchangeable, so you can change it for a different style wheel depending on the type of driving that you're going to be doing. Now, look, in terms of feel, I really don't think there's a whole lot of difference between the two of them, just sort of sitting here on the bench. So I think that's pretty much everything we need to cover in terms of a side-by-side comparison up here. Let's now get this mounted up onto our Next Level Racing GT Lite and see what the driving experience is like. All right, so we've got all the gear mounted up on the Next Level Racing GT Lite. Now, no issues with the wheelbase at all. 2 M6 bolts in the back, and that is good to go. There's a little bit of flex there, but we'll talk about that when we're driving in a moment. Pedals, a little bit more problematic. We've already done a little bit of driving testing here, and you can see there's already a little bit of wear on the, well, not wear, but you can see where that's kind of been broken in and the outer coating's been a little bit worn off. So we have been driving with this a little bit, and we've uncovered a couple of little issues here. First of all, let's talk about the mod, and then we'll go into the issues. So the little conical brake mod that's installed there is pretty much essential. Without it, I mean, it's essentially operating exactly the same as the spring on the clutch pedals. There's not really any progressiveness to the spring rate at all as you compress it, so you really have no sensation underfoot of exactly how hard you're pressing the pedal. Now, obviously, when you're braking in a car, it's pressure that's important, not position. But because we're using potentiometers here and there's no increase in pressure as you're pushing the pedal down, you really just don't get a sense of exactly how much pressure you're exerting, and it makes it very difficult to drive. So we've talked about the same thing with Logitech G27 pedals, G920 pedals in the past. We talked about with the G923 video, the review that we did, as well as the part 1 of this series, that this progressive spring rate that they've put in there now, the progressive spring, does help that quite a bit. And you do kind of have a quite nicely defined pressure point that you can push down to and kind of threshold brake around that. Now, without the conical mod, this brake pedal doesn't have that sensation at all, so it's very difficult to brake properly. With this installed, it actually feels pretty good. What we find is that you can kind of push to the threshold, and then you've got maybe sort of like a 10 to 15, maybe at worst 20% amount of kind of movement around there. And again, because we're dealing with position rather than pressure, you can see as I'm moving that around there, that amount of movement is translating to, yeah, around sort of 10 to 15, 20% at worst brake pressure increase in the game. But because we're not actually feeling any difference in the pressure underfoot, it makes it quite difficult to modulate the braking around that and really extract those maximum lap times. So the pedals in this kit are absolutely the weak point. And again, we'll talk about this more when we drive. But we also uncovered a bit of an issue with the mounting solution. So if I flip it up here, you can see we have 2 M6 bolts at the top of the rig here, but we don't have any way of mounting through the bottom here from factory. What we would need to do is drill 2 holes in here and actually put some sort of a reinforcement bar, almost like what we have here, but flipped upside down on the inside of the rig here, or on the inside of the pedal box, to give us the ability to mount it on the bottom here. Now, it is exacerbated a little bit by the nature of this particular rig, because what's happening, and I'll fold it back down again so you can see, when we push on the brake pedal really hard, and I'll actually jump in the rig to demonstrate this for you, we can see we push the brake pedal down and the entire assembly is actually rocking back and forth here. Now, as I said, this is exacerbated by the design of this rig. If we had a steel plate that we're actually bolting to that extended towards the front of the pedals, you can imagine it wouldn't be able to tilt forward as much because it would be limited on the front. But the fact that we don't have any anchoring going on at the back here means there's always going to be that kind of up and down flex. And the reason that's so bad is because it's actually pivoting on exactly the point where we're exerting the pressure. So this is working like a big lever and causing the pedals to rock back and forth, as you can see there. And with what we talked about before, with the sort of 10 to 15, maybe 20% percentage uncertainty on the brake input, you can imagine when you're actually putting force on the pedal and the whole thing's flexing like that, it makes it even harder. Now, you could of course argue that because the flex is always the same amount, then you can kind of still adjust your muscle memory and set muscle memory around it. But there's another problem here. So if I've got my right foot or my throttle foot firmly planted on the base like this and I'm pushing from here, that's kind of anchoring my brake. So you can see there, if I'm consciously pushing down on my right heel, I'm able to actually limit that amount of flex. So that actually changes how the brake feels compared to if I were maybe pushing down on the throttle a little bit, or if I lift my heel up even. You can see now there's way more flex in that brake than there is when I've got my right heel planted. Now, a lot of people tend to, when they're braking, push their bottom up in the seat and actually slide their heels up as well. So you often will see people actually braking like that rather than braking with their heel. And when you're clutching and braking and heeling and towing, it adds a lot of variables in there. So the point here is the amount of flex that we're seeing isn't always going to be the same, and that's going to make setting muscle memory very, very difficult. So what we're going to do as a temporary solution here, we did already go for a drive, and both Tom and I found it almost impossible to get a lap around Nordschleife in the 962 without, having problems with spinning or just, not being able to brake efficiently. So to quickly summarize here before we get into the driving test, the T3PA pedals, if you've got them sitting on the floor and you're not using the conical mod, they're much more difficult to drive with than the Logitech G923 pedals are, I believe. Remembering again that the G923 pedals are a little bit improved over the previous models. So the 920 and earlier, they do have that progressive spring in them now, which does make a significant difference, at least in my opinion. But when we install the conical brake mod, it does greatly improve the feeling of the brake, but it also makes it a lot more difficult to use these just sitting on the floor. So you do kind of need to have them mounted to something solid once you install this. And as we said before, I believe that's the reason why it's removable and not installed by default, because they know a lot of people will just be running these on the floor and they're going to have problems with them sliding around or tipping up when they're braking. So I think really what we need to have here to really get the most out of these pedals is some sort of a mounting solution that allows us to bolt from the front as well as the back, because that's going to reduce that flex and it's definitely going to transform the experience. But what we'll do now is we'll do our best to mitigate that as best we possibly can with what we have here. Again, remembering that we're trying to recreate a realistic scenario for somebody who's, got the budget for these kinds of pedals, this kind of a rig, and, not wanting to spend any more money on top of that. So we're going to jerry rig something as you would at home, and let's see what the driving experience is like once we've done that. All right, so we've quickly thrown together some cable ties that we just had laying around here. Ideally, obviously, you don't want to have something poking up where your foot's going to be when you're clutching or anything like that, but you get the idea here, and I'm pleased to say that now I can push on that brake pedal and it's not lifting up at all. There's no, well, a tiny little bit, but within what I would say is an acceptable range. So you can see there illustrated perfectly what we would achieve if we did have some proper mounting points down at the base of the pedals. But anyway, let's move into our driving test now. So let's head out here now, go for a little bit of drive and talk about what I'm feeling. So we'll start off talking about the pedals and then we'll move into the wheelbase, which I am actually really impressed with. So I'm gonna brake nice and heavily to my threshold point here and get turned in and just sort of try and modulate around as we go through these next little section of twisties here. So there's a little touch on the brake here just to keep the car planted and braking heavily. So what I can tell you there is like the amount of resistance I'm feeling, and you can see there I was actually able to catch a slide, which we'll talk about in just a moment too, something I wouldn't have been able to do so naturally with the G923 for sure. But what I'm feeling here is as I brake, and you can see there, perfect example, I just kind of started to slide. So the difference in resistance between when I hit that brake mod pressure point and the initial braking is basically minimum. So there's no difference there at all. So I'm really not able to feel, other than just through the position in my ankle, how much brake I'm actually applying there. It's not sloppy, like there's some resistance there and it's consistent, but I'm just not feeling an increase. So really what I find myself doing is just immediately, and we'll see it here as I brake into the sweeping right-hander. So we'll come around and I'm immediately just braking to my sort of 100% threshold there, and I'm able to modulate around it a little bit. We'll pull up here again and I'll just sort of talk about it. But as I was saying before, there's kind of that movement in the pedal there, which equates to about maybe 10, 15, 20 at worst % variance in braking pressure as it's translated. Remembering again that we're using a potentiometer here, so we're transcoding positional information into pressure information, which is kind of what creates the problem. Now remember again, we are talking about a cheap set of pedals, and you could absolutely adapt yourself to get used to that, but you're never going to have that detail that just isn't there to begin with. You're never going to be able to feel that pressure variation quite to the same extent as you can. And again, you can see there, I just had no real control over what I was doing with my brakes. And again, like I've only just jumped in this car, I've only just started driving, so it is going to take a little bit of time to adapt to it, of course. But I'm not adapting to these pedals as quickly as I was able to with the G923 pedals. And I think it's just purely down to not having that variation in the amount of brake pressure, not being able to feel what I'm doing quite so cleanly. So what I would say based on that straight away, before we even talk about the wheelbase, is, the performance of the wheelbase definitely doesn't match the performance of these pedals. These are pedals that they've kind of just thrown in to make it a kit. And if you're just kind of doing driving where you want a nice immersive experience where, you might be, just wanting to cruise around or just have a bit of basic fun without being competitive, I think that, if you want the immersion that a high quality wheelbase gives you, but you want to have a kit that comes with pedals and everything as well, then they're absolutely fine. Like, you're not going to not have fun. But I think when it comes to trying to be competitive, then absolutely you're going to want to do something about the pedals to make them feel that little bit better. And what we might do is sort of investigate from here what kind of mods we have available with these pedals, how we can improve the feeling for minimum amount of spend. before we look at upgrading to something like the T-LCM pedals, load cell pedals, which I assume are going to give us much better control over our braking in general. But yeah, to start off with, at least I can say the pedals are absolutely the weak point of this setup, as I expected they would be, remembering again that to purchase these pedals on their own is only $100 US, and we're talking about a kit that costs a lot more than that when you include the wheel and the wheelbase, of course. So let's talk a little bit more about the force feedback now and the quality there in general. I think that, straight away, without question, this is a much better, higher quality force feedback experience than the Logitech G923 is, and of course, we absolutely expected that being so much more expensive than what we have with the G923. But more objectively, what I'm feeling, what the differences are, is I'm able to feel those little micro corrections as they need to happen. So you'll remember in the part 1 video, I talked about the fact that I was having to rely on my reactions being more based on what I was seeing visually on the screen than what I was actually feeling through the wheel. Now, interestingly, there was actually a segment on the Formula 1 broadcast last night where they were talking about Lewis Hamilton reaching 100 pole positions. And one of the things that he actually said in that video is that he doesn't spend a whole lot of time in the simulator because he doesn't feel that it actually benefits the experience on track and actually adds anything to that. And one of the things that he and Martin Brundle actually discussed at length, which I found really interesting, was Lewis said that one of the last thing that you actually use to react to what's going on is what you're actually seeing with your eyes. So you're feeling what the car's doing, you're reacting to what the car's doing from the seat of the pants feeling, rather than actually sort of saying, oh, I can see that the car's moving, I can see that the car's sliding, and having to correct that way. Now, what I said in the part 1 video is that because the information is there, because you can see what's going on, you can react to what's going on, you can teach yourself to react to that information. And as we said in that video, that's the reason why people are able to drive very competitively with very entry-level gear. But I think what it really comes down to is when it comes to overall consistency, you are always going to react faster to what you're feeling and more precisely to what you're feeling than what you're seeing when it comes down to it. So I think that's really where the benefit comes in on an upgraded wheelbase like this in terms of performance. But I think where the biggest difference is just in the level of immersion. This feels a lot more genuine, this feels a lot more precise, and it feels a lot more like the experience of driving a real car, going over bumps and feeling the texture of the road, feeling the movement of the car. So overall, it's a much more immersive experience than driving with the G923. And again, we expect that, but absolutely I would say, if you have the money to spend and you're after that little bit more immersion, then this is absolutely a worthwhile upgrade in the form of the wheelbase at least. Now the wheel is really nice as well. I like the feeling of the Alcantara in my hands, and the 310mm diameter is really good. So very happy with the wheel. The button presses as well, adequate. They're not the best buttons in the world, but you wouldn't expect them to be for the price either. So they're certainly not a shortfall of the setup by any means. And I guess, one thing that we haven't talked about is the comparison with the CSL Elite wheelbase, simply because those appear to be discontinued now. You can't buy them other than secondhand. But the fact that you can still buy them secondhand means that we should at least mention them. And what I would say comparatively in terms of the quality of the force feedback compared to the CSL Elite wheelbases, I think that the reaction time out of this base is maybe a little bit faster. The force feedback feels a little bit more granular and a little bit more detailed. I think there's a little bit more fidelity in there than we have with the CSL Elite wheelbase. And even as far as to say, I think that the CSL Elite wheelbase maybe feels a little bit clunky. I remember when I did the review of that base, comparing it to the Club Sport wheelbase 2.5, it just generally felt a lot less refined. And although the detail with that base is good, it does tend to have a bit of a ball and cup kind of feeling when it comes to the force feedback textures that you're feeling. So bumps in the road and details like that tend to just kind of clunk around with the CSL Elite, regardless of how much fine tuning that you do. So it feels a lot closer to the G923 in that regard, at least if you take out the overall strength in terms of Newton meters. But what I would say is that there is an underpinning level of graininess to the force feedback on the Thrustmaster base that isn't there with the CSL Elite. So overall, the CSL Elite is a little bit smoother, just in terms of rolling the wheel through, you can actually feel the graininess on this wheel as you turn it. Kind of similar, I would say, to the SimMagic M10. That's probably the closest wheelbase I've felt in terms of just that kind of cogging and torque ripply kind of effect as we're just turning the wheel when we're stationary. But in terms of the actual fidelity of the force feedback, I do feel like this is a step up from the CSL Elite wheelbase, and I think it's probably a little bit closer to the Club Sport wheelbase 2.5 in regards to just the overall feeling and what I think it feels the most like, or most similar to, out of all the wheelbases that I've tested. So another thing that I would say is that at this point, we are definitely approaching the limits of what I'd be comfortable recommending in terms of a cockpit for a wheelbase like this. I'd say, we are, at 6 Newton meters, we are kind of getting a bit more flex, and it's a bit more noticeable when I'm driving now. And that's not to say that you can't have a good experience and be competitive, but you're definitely losing some of that fidelity in the texture. So I'd say, if you're spending this kind of money on a wheelbase, you're probably going to start, wanting to go down that rabbit hole of having a high quality cockpit as well. Whether that be something that you DIY, you could probably do some reinforcement work on this as well in the form of some extra bracing or something like that if you're, talented in that way. So you absolutely could make this work. And, you're not going to have a bad overall experience using a cockpit like this. But I'd say if you're spending this kind of money on this kind of wheelbase, then you're probably going to want to have a more sturdy cockpit as well. So it really just comes down to what your budget is. Again, like I said, you can have a perfectly good experience with this. You can have a lot of fun. And, I'm going absolutely fine here. There's no problems at all. But to really get the most out of this wheelbase, you are going to want to have a more solid cockpit than the Next Level Racing GT Lite. So conclusions on the Thrustmaster TS-XW, both as an upgrade or an initial starting point if you're looking at a more entry-level sim rig. So I think that, well, the first thing we need to talk about is lap times, because obviously you're going to be wondering about that. Now, both Tom and I spent about the same amount of time with this setup as we did with the G923 setup in the part 1 video, and we were both pretty much on par with our lap times from the G923, which is pretty much what we expected. We have both improved our lap times since that first video, and I'll put a link down in the description for the leaderboard on our website where you can check out those times. But really, both of us agreed that when it came down to it, the experience was very much limited by the pedals that come in this combo, the T3PA pedals. They're definitely the first thing that I would be upgrading from here. And that kind of brings the entire package into question, because the experience with the wheelbase is really great. It's a massive improvement over what you get with the G923. The wheel's comfortable, the buttons feel good for the price point as well. And just overall, the level of immersion that you get and the ability to make those little micro corrections, catch slides and things like that are so much better with this wheelbase than they are with the G923. So in terms of the overall package and the experience, I can definitely see, in the wheel and the wheelbase and the quality that we have there, where that extra money is going. Remembering again that depending, of course, on where you buy it, this is around about double the price for this package as what you'd pay for a G923 brand new. So where does this leave us in terms of our upgrade path? So definitely an improvement with the wheelbase and the wheel over the G923. Obviously, we expected that. I'm disappointed with the pedals that come bundled with this. I think that they're, no better than the pedals that we had with the G923, and in some ways, not even as good as those pedals are. So definitely some improvement to be had there. So I think the next thing that I'd be doing is probably actually looking at a different package. I think instead of getting the TS-XW, I'd probably look at getting a TS-PC and maybe T-LCM pedals or something like that bundled together. That's going to end up being around about 20% more expensive than what we have here, but definitely going to give us better value for money, I believe. So that's where we're going to go next in the video series. We're going to be switching over to the TS-PC, which doesn't have the Xbox compatibility, but does come with a Ferrari 488 wheel, which does have a few extra features, which we'll be taking a look in that video as well. Doesn't come bundled with pedals, but you can purchase it as a bundle with T-LCM pedals, which I believe are going to be a significant upgrade over the pedals that we've tested here today. So that covers this kit as an upgrade from the G923. But I think, if you're looking at buying sim racing gear for the first time, I think my recommendation would probably be about the same. I think that it's probably, if you can afford it, worthwhile buying a different package that gives you better quality pedals to begin with, because you're just not getting the best experience from these pedals, and I don't think that they're really worthy of being paired with a wheelbase and wheel of this quality. They just really are the weak point in this package overall. But that said, I think if you're just wanting to have an immersive experience, you're not necessarily too worried about being competitive. Maybe, you just like driving around with your friends and drifting and things like that, where braking precision maybe isn't quite so important, then yeah, you're going to have a good experience with this. You're certainly not going to be, disappointed. I just think that there is better value to be had by slightly better pedals when paired with a wheelbase and a wheel of this caliber. Hopefully that helps you guys out. If you've enjoyed the video, please do leave a thumbs up. And thank you very much once again to Pagnian Imports for providing us with this gear for review for you guys. And we do have some links down in the description below. If you do decide you want to pick up any of this gear, a small percentage of the profits from those sales come back to help out with the channel as well. So thank you very much for the support there. But above all, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching. Please, of course, leave a comment below as well. Let us know what you guys think. Do you own this gear already, and does your experience match ours, or do you think something completely different? I think the best value in these videos always comes from, you know, as a community pulling together and sharing our overall experience so that people that are looking to buy this kind of gear for the first time have the best possible experience from all of us together. So thank you very much for that. Thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.